Okay, so for my project, I tried to explore um, different ways of using ChatGPT to um, conduct critical inquiry, essentially. So I wanted to see how it would do at conducting a critical inquiry, as well as how it would do as facilitating critical inquiry, and then specifically to using Balin and Batterby's guidelines in Reason and the Balance. So I started by um, just asking um, it without any prompting whatsoever. Just, can you guide me in conducting a critical inquiry? And it said sure, and it gave me kind of like, here's a generic process, of define your question, gather information, evaluate, analyze, thesis, and like fairly long, but also like a fairly generic, inoffensive process. And I asked it about if it was familiar with Balin Batterby's method from their textbook, and uh, it said it didn't have specific information about it. Um, and so then I started a new conversation, so it wouldn't remember any of that history, and just started over. And then I wanted to see, like, can you describe their inquiry method? And it gave general answers that were not really in line with, I mean, like, they're not, I don't think there's anything like offensive in here or like really wrong, but it wasn't really their specific method. I asked it where it got its information, and it said it was just based off of kind of general critical thinking and education principles, and told me to like look at their specific methods or their specific works. And I asked if it was looking at their original works, and it said no, it wasn't. So then I again tried to like, what their guidelines for inquiry are, and it gave some, but again, these were pretty generic. They weren't like in fully aligned with what the book said. Um, and I asked them for their guiding questions, and again, I think it's just kind of drawing this from general critical thinking research. So at this point, I just wanted to see what it could come up with without me giving it any additional information. But then I pivoted to saying, okay, now I'm going to give you some specific information. So they have Balin Battersby. They have a like open access paper on that's summarizing their textbook and their approach to kind of critical thinking pedagogy. So I told it I was going to upload that paper, and then have it try to describe their process again. So I did that, and then it pulled out the like key points of that paper quite well about dialectical dimension of thinking, dialogical aspect of inquiry, inquiry in specific context, emphasis on the spirit of inquiry, and it did give the exact guiding questions for inquiry now. So I kind of was just trying to test that it didn't have that information before, and was trying to be quite direct with it, asking those things. But now that I've given it this information from their open access article, it does actually have like quite a clear view of what their process is. So I asked it to reflect on the accuracy of its original responses, and it commented on basically everything, saying like, no, I didn't, that it was just talking about general principles, but not their specific things. So that it has distinctive features that were not fully captured in its original response. So I asked it about like how it could assist and guide me in that process, in their method, and so then it kind of came up with some different ways that it could help me, like refining the question to make sure it's specific and meaningful, help identifying the nature of the claims and their implications, identify data, arguments, different sources, give background information, help evaluate logic, aid in organizing discussions, and help that the conclusions are logically following from the analysis. And the reflection, I think, is actually, some of this stuff is actually a bit confused, I think. It's kind of blending some of their specific method and some of the general critical thinking methods at this point. But this is just kind of because this has been a messy conversation. I'll get to a more specific one later. So then I just tried to say, okay, like, can you guide me through this process? And I go into detail in a different video about like exactly what it did here, but it did a decent job. I gave it a question, and it kind of gave some specific answer or like guidance for like what each step of that process would look like. But I really wanted it to be like a step-by-step guide. So I kind of played around with it, trying to get it to do that. And, how would you go about step one? And then it was able to do that fairly well. The question was around about, can education systems be described as, accurately described as a form of slavery? And um, I'm going in knowing that I want to refine this question further and wanting to try and help it be involved in that process. And it gave some pretty good context for this. Like what are the systems that we're considering? What are the goals? Like it did actually break down step one quite well. I was quite happy with that. And I tried to have it go through a process on its own at this point, and it got kind of confused. I've bounced around a lot in this conversation, saying like, guide me through the process. Okay, now you do the process. So it started kind of getting into hypotheticals and didn't work super well. And I gave it some feedback, and it eventually kind of it did get to a reasoned judgment, but it was fairly generic. So I wasn't like overly thrilled with how it did here, but I didn't really disagree with what it said. It just was like not that helpful. It was just kind of like what you might come up with if you didn't really look into it all that much. So anyways, eventually I started a new conversation where I actually, like, from the beginning, sorry, technical glitch. So I eventually started a new conversation, kind of starting over, because that conversation had kind of bounced around a lot and gotten quite messy, trying to figure things out. So I started a new conversation to start from scratch and gave it this context, saying that I'm going to give it this document that summarizes their approach to critical thinking. This was their open access paper, and wanted it. I wanted to perform a critical inquiry using their method and would like it to guide me through the process one step at a time and provide me with direction to their inquiry process, as well as provide feedback on whether I'm in alignment or out of alignment with their guidelines, and asked if it understood its role. And it did, so I gave it the document. And again, it gave like a pretty good summary of what that document was. And I'd refined my question a little bit since then, and so asked it if it was if there are any modern educational practices that could be considered a violation of child's human rights. And here now it was, again, like, gave kind of a general overview of each step of that process, what it might look like, but it was going through the step-by-step now by saying, okay, like, would you like to start by gathering arguments and evidence? It did kind of skip past steps 1 and 2, but it kind of was saying that, like, the question was specific and clear, so it was kind of giving me a pass on question 1. And but I did kind of want it to go more deep into question 2. It kind of just said that it was, it accurately identified the claim, which I quite appreciated, but I wanted to talk more about the judgments. So then it gave me a great description of the judgments, I thought, in here. It started talking about that there's ethical judgments and legal judgments and practical judgments, gave criteria for evaluation, and kind of said, like, now that we've got a clear understanding of the claim and judgments at issue, would you like to begin with step 3, gathering, examining evidence? And yes, I would. And so this was really what I was wanting it to do, was give you this step-by-step kind of facilitation of an inquiry. And it gave me some suggestions of, like, topics to kind of inquire into for, like, examples and arguments and counter arguments, and some other things, and gave me some general guidelines too of that were in line with the spirit of inquiry and their process of, like, seeking multiple perspectives. And here it talks about some of the spirit of inquiry stuff about maintaining an open mind and critical approach, check for biases, consider reliability of sources, and asks if I need further guidance or anything I want to discuss with it too. So I felt like it was facilitating it really well, and I wanted to see if it could give me some specific examples. So it gave more specific, but it didn't give any evidence for them or any, like, sources. So I asked it for some sources, and it did provide some, but it was just kind of saying, like, this article by this website. And so I'd go to that website, but I couldn't necessarily find these ones very easily. I'm not sure if they were real or not. The websites were real, and they seemed like they were good sources, but I still couldn't tell. It didn't give me specific papers or anything. So I asked it for that, and it gave me those. Gave me some specific papers that did seem like that they would be a decent place to investigate. I didn't, look super hard into whether they were reliable sources, but they definitely seemed like they would be good starting points for sure. And I asked it a question here, like, this is one of the things that we needed to define. So I thought, like, this could give me some starting points about the basic human rights of children. And it, again, gave me some good starting points to investigate for that. And so I said I was ready for the next step of the process. And it guided me through what the context of the issue, what kind of things I need to be looking at here. And I kind of appreciate the level of guidance it was giving here. They're still pretty general, but they were specific to my topic. Like the historical evolution of education practices and human rights perspectives. So that's still very broad, but it is giving more specific than just historical and cultural context. And evaluate reasons and arguments. And then the last step, when I said I'm ready for the next step, it gives me the last step of reaching a reasoned judgment. And integrate your findings, form a conclusion, reflect on the process, be open to revision. And again, I'm happy that it felt like it was in line with the spirit of inquiry of being open to new possibility that could modify your judgment, and critical things an ongoing process. I asked it to reflect on how it did, and it gave a somewhat weak reflection, but it did give one. So at this point, I felt like I was ready to create a GPT that was specific to this. So that's where you can create basically a version of ChatGPT that has some initial information in it. So these are kind of variations on ChatGPT, and this is one that I made that basically just gave it that initial prompt and a document. So these are custom versions of ChatGPT where you basically like preloaded some information in ahead of time. So essentially what I did was took what I learned from my initial conversation with ChatGPT and provide it with a prompt that document. So specifically, I can edit this GPT, and in this configure is where I've kind of done this stuff. So I've named it the Critical Inquiry Facilitator, and it guides users through critical inquiry using Balin-Batterby's method. And this is the instructions that I've given it here. So it has some starting, kind of prompts that you can use if you want to. But I've uploaded that same open access paper, and then this is the prompt I've given it, which is similar to what I've said in the previous conversations. Your job is to be a critical inquiry facilitator by guiding the user through. Oh, there's a bit of a typo. By guiding the user through Balin-Batterby's critical inquiry process, you should guide them through each step of the process one step at a time, and give the user feedback that helps them align with Balin-Batterby's guidelines and their description of the spirit of inquiry. This next paragraph is, I only wrote part of it. It wrote part of it through this kind of create process over here by having a conversation through it. I left some of it in. I'm not sure how happy I am with all of it, but this is mostly just about like the tone that it's supposed to have when it's talking to people. And then I tried to say to start by prompting the user for a topic or of question or for critical inquiry. So anyways, this is the GPT that I've made to be a facilitator for critical inquiry using their process. And so now this is something that I can then share to anyone who has a link. I could make it publicly available as well, but for now I just have made it kind of private. So I'll provide a link to this, and maybe I can put that in the video description as well. But now I could just say, even if I just say hi, it should kind of prompt me for a critical inquiry. Yeah, so if you have a topic or question in mind that you'd like to explore together through critical inquiry, feel free to share it, and we can begin the process together. And so what I did in one of the videos was I asked the question in a very general way, in a way that I was hoping to see if it would criticize and like give that feedback to help guide that inquiry. So I said, is education a form of slavery? Right, so this is obviously like a charged way of saying it, and also a very vague way of saying the question. So then it's giving an overview of the process and giving some comments about each one. And it did a really good job of this last time. It looks like it did this time as well, of saying, to clarify the issue, defining education. What's your understanding of education? Are we discussing formal schooling? Does it involve self-education and informal learning? And similarly, how are you defining slavery? Historically, slavery is understood as a condition in which individuals are owned by others who control where they live and at what they work. So I feel like last time it maybe gave like a little bit more context to this, but either way, I think that like it picked up on that, like, to clarify the issue, we need to talk about what is education and what is slavery, and so I felt like it, was providing. If someone asked that question, it's providing them with legitimate feedback, and what identifying types of claims of judgment is the question making a factual claim. Yeah, so this is just kind of generic. It's not really saying something anything about education here, but it's just saying like about that, which is great. Arguments for, arguments against, contextualizing the issue, comparative evaluation, reaching a reasoned judgment. And so now let's start with the first step. Could you clarify how you're defining education and slavery in your question? This will help us to ensure we're addressing the issue accurately. And so now this would start that process of, I love this. It's prompting me now to better clarify my question, and then it will continue to walk me through the process. So I'm sure that it's far from perfect, but I think this is pretty much a functional facilitator for going through the critical inquiry method from Balin Batterby's textbook. So if you want more detail on everything I just described here, I was kind of taking a video diary of my process of going through each of those conversations. So this was a kind of a semi-short overview, but I have much more detail there if you're interested.